32 teams in 32 days. This is episode 19, the Chicago Bears episode. Let's welcome in Usayd Koshul, Bears reporter for Bear Report. Usayd, what's going on, my man?
I am doing well, man. How are you? Congrats on getting credentialed at the draft. But
Thank
yeah,
you, man.
thanks again. Thanks so much for having me on, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. This is the first time we've talked in person, but we've known each other for a while, and I'm excited to have you on here.
Definitely. I know we used to do some work together, right? I know you're a big Bengals fan, so I helped you put together kind of a Bengals podcast. You met
Yeah.
so many great people through that, dude. But really, I would say our relationship's always been like I know it should be like a working or colleagues relationship, but I consider us like good friends, dude. Because I know we text back and forth every now and then obviously we have Snapchat too. So really, dude, we're connected in like a variety of ways.
Yep, for sure, 100%. So let's talk some Bears, and it must be frustrating to say the least. A very, very limited offseason. Only players that you guys brought from out of out of state were a cornerback that's a downgrade, a backup running back, and then Andy Dalton. I guess we'll start with the quarterback position. Out goes Mitch, in steps Dalton. Struck out on Deshaun Watson. You struck out on Russell Wilson. Dalton comes in on a 1-year deal. Were you expecting this? And do you even think he's an upgrade over the quarterback play that you guys had last year?
I mean, I would say yes, I was expecting this, and here's why. Because I do 2 weekly podcasts, and for two different networks. One's about the Chicago Bears in the NFL draft. The other one's just about the Bears. And on the Bears centric one, well, really on both, I was talking about, hey, listen, you are getting into free agency, you're getting into the draft. You're in a situation where, okay, yeah, you could still make a play for one of these five quarterbacks that's going to be drafted in round one. But are you really going to go into 2021 with Nick Foles as your starter? I said, no, that's not happening. So I kind of expected Andy Dalton. I knew that the Bears weren't on Russell Wilson, but they just couldn't offer an enticing enough package that was going to bring in Russell Wilson. So what do? You go to Andy Dalton. And I knew, because I wrote this in articles on Bear Report, I was like, hey, there's not a single veteran quarterback that would really be a significant upgrade. But you go out, you get Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton is more accomplished than Mitch Trubisky. I think a lot of Bears fans right now are like, oh, well, he's a terrible quarterback. I think, and I know you being a Bengals fan, you've seen this more than I do. Dalton he's never been a quarterback that's really elevated players around him, but he's been good enough. And I think for the Bears right now, they're just trying to find a solution that's good enough. Ultimately, you look at the situation, you're getting a guy that's been to a couple Pro Bowls, granted, has never won a playoff game, but has at least gone ahead and played some good football, at least has some good experience. And then you look at the familiarity aspect with Bill Lazor. The Bears always bring in quarterbacks that are familiar with the coaching staff. They did it with Chase Daniel and Tyler Bray, because both those guys had worked with Matt Nagy. They traded for Nick Foles last offseason, who had a history with Bill Lazor, John DeFilippo, and Matt Nagy. And now this offseason, you land Andy Dalton, who has a familiarity with Bill Lazor. So ultimately, it's kind of like connecting dots here. They wanted not just any quarterback, but someone who was going to be familiar with the coaching staff, and that ended up being Nagy.
And Dalton went through a couple coordinators in Cincinnati. He really did connect with Bill Lazor. That was more towards the end of his tenure in Cincinnati. Lots of Hugh Jacksons and those types of people. But Bill Lazor, they connected towards the end of Dalton's tenure in Cincinnati, and Lazor went to Chicago, and Dalton finds himself there a couple years later after the short stint in Dallas. And living in Missouri, there are a ton of Bears fans here, and it's really funny because I'm like the only Bengals fan that lives here. It's really sad, but they've all been coming to me like, "What's Dalton like? What's he like?" I'm like, "He's not going to lose you a game, and he's definitely not going to win you a game." Like 9 years of Andy Dalton just being good enough to be able to win games. The last time Dalton really felt like he was playing well was when the Bengals started 4-1 in 2018. After that, it went downhill. He ended the season injured that year. And then 2019 was, of course, the technically Joe Burrow year when they went 2-14. But Dalton should be fine, I would say. But you mentioned the quarterback position and just having it be good enough. Obviously, they made the playoffs last year. Having that type of mindset at the quarterback position for a multiple amount of years is probably not going to get it done in the playoffs, right?
It's not
Would you?
gonna. Right, it's not going to get it done. I think if you're the Bears right now, I also have to look at, and this is for a lot of you Bears fans that are listening, you look at where the team is at, right? So in 2017, Ryan Pace signs Mike Glennon in free agency. What does he do? He doubles down on saying Glennon's the starter, drafts Mitch Trubisky. In 2020, right, says, oh, well, Mitch Trubisky's the starter, kind of double down on that, traded for Nick Foles. This year, goes ahead and says Andy Dalton's the starter, double down on Andy Dalton, double down on it too. Now all of a sudden you look at that past history, you realize there's probably a quarterback move that's on the way. And then the other half of it is this, is that ultimately the Bears know that they need to figure this out. I would actually argue that this is part of a 2-year plan, because if the Bears draft a rookie quarterback, now you're giving Pace and Nagy have some extra leverage in the sense that they can go to Ted Phillips and George McCaskey, the owner, as well as the president or the chairman of the team, and be like, hey, listen, right? We know that we failed with Trubisky. We get that. We're going to indirectly admit our mistake. But we have this new quarterback now in a Justin Fields or a Trey Lance. He's good enough to get the job done. You just got to give us one more year. And then obviously you look at some of the moves the Bears have made. They're trying to invest more in offense than they are in defense, because it's just a franchise that historically has been known for defense, right? But that's not the way the league is anymore. So you have to invest in the offensive side of the ball more. And look at the numbers, for example, for the Bears. So like 2020, their cap hit was like 117 million or something for the defense alone. All right, for offense, it was like 65 or 66 million. That's nearly half of what it is, right? So when you look at it, they're trying to kind of build up the offense at the expense of the defense.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Bears have had one of the best defenses for a while, and part of that bringing over Khalil Mack and giving the Raiders that type of compensation a couple years ago, and he's been a huge piece. But the Bears haven't been able to score points, and part of that's, well, a lot of that has been due to the lack of talent at the quarterback position. Jay Cutler was good for a while, and then since then it hasn't been anything. There was Mike Glennon. I can't remember who was there before, but Mike Glennon, Nick Foles, Mitch Trubisky, the whole debacle with babysitting him and bringing in people to replace him, and then he finally, I thought he was playing pretty decent towards the end of the year, and then not good enough to re-sign or earn that second contract. Now you bring in Andy Dalton. At some point, they have to get the position right.
They do, and I think what's interesting this year is that, especially with this pre-draft process, is that the Bears are picking at 20, but I would still think that they're probably going to end up picking a quarterback in the first round, especially if Justin Fields or Trey Lance starts to fall. And then you add in this dynamic. I think that the Bears this year, they're involving nearly everyone in the quarterback search. That means Matt Nagy's being involved, John DeFilippo, the quarterbacks coach, as is Bill Lazor. So really, they use the word collaboration a lot, which gets on a lot of Bears fans' nerves. Before Chicago, they're kind of collaborating this year on really trying to figure out what a solution is. And I know I tweeted this out today, but like Matt Nagy was spotted at Justin Fields' second pro day, and we're recording this on April 14th. I'm sorry. But Nagy being at Justin Fields' second pro day kind of tells you something, that the Bears are interested enough in Fields. They sent their lead quarterback guy, which again is Nagy, to figure out the quarterback position, kind of say, hey, does Justin Fields really fit what you're looking for?
I thought he looked pretty good today, and he's my quarterback too. But let's talk about that. So they're picking at 20, 52, 83, 164. They don't have a fourth, but obviously, I've heard quarterback is a pretty important thing to have. There's quite a few of them this year. But sitting at pick 20, and you mentioned the potential of one of those two guys starting to fall, that's still pretty far down. Does Chicago have enough in the arsenal to trade up and make that type of move?
They do, but I think people have to understand something, is that it's probably going to require a 2021 first round. It's obviously going to require a 2021 first round pick, a 2021 third round pick, and then what you're also looking at is the possibility that you have to dig into your 2022 draft capital. And what that means is hey, are you willing to sacrifice a 2022 maybe first and second round pick, or a 2022 1 and a 2022 3 to go ahead and sweeten the deal. And I think that that's the package that's going to be enticing enough to get it done. Now, with regards to where they jump to, if you're going to trade all the way up to fourth with the Falcons, then you have to throw in a 2023 first round pick as well. But if you're trading with a team like Carolina or Denver, let's say, you're looking at two teams that don't have they have some needs that can be acquired by trading back as well, or can be addressed by trading back. I mean, you look at Carolina, people are saying, well, what if they take a quarterback? I don't think the Panthers are going to take a quarterback simply because they just traded for Sam Darnold and they're going to pick his fifth-year option up, meaning they're committed to him for at least 2 more years. And then Denver, they have Drew Lock there, right? They thought about trading for Nick Foles and nothing materialized there. So ultimately, I think that for the Bears, right, the best case scenario for them is that if Fields or Lance slips, then you're in a situation where you trade up for them with either Denver or Carolina, or you get on the phones with a team like Miami, for example, who has shown under the ownership there, Steven Ross, and I forgot the GM's name, but I know Brian Flores is the head coach. They've been very adamant about moving up and down the draft board.
And yeah, 6 is a sweet spot because Miami, and once again, on the other side of things, there has to be the other team, or it takes 2 to tango. It takes 2 teams to play ball. So as much as the Bears probably might want to trade up, it's going to take another team to be willing to move down 13, 14 slots. There should be no reason why Miami won't want to, because they almost just made the playoffs with that roster. They love having lots of picks. They have moved down and not plenty of times already this draft, last draft that they moved up, I think. So they like having lots of picks. That would seem reasonable for them to want to move down, pick up a couple extra firsts, so they could go that way. But let's kind of talk about their free agency a little bit. They brought back Allen Robinson on the franchise tag. This was sort of expected that they couldn't just let him walk. Do you see a long-term deal in the future for Allen Robinson and Chicago?
Honestly, I don't, and here's why. Because I get the Bears are super busy right now with their draft stuff, but then it's just like the franchise tag deadline to get players onto a long-term deal is July 15th, right? And we're about 3 months away from that. I think with you're the Bears, what's going to happen is the draft's going to pass. Then you have May and June essentially, and then July is going to roll around, and it's going to be crunch time. I just think that the two sides are too far apart to the point where maybe they do something during the season. I don't see that really happening either. I think that at best Chicago will try and revisit this whole Robinson fiasco next offseason, but they know what he brings to the table because he's been their most productive player over the last 3 seasons. It's just going to be a matter of, hey, are you willing to go ahead and pay Allen Robinson the $20 million plus a year that he wants? Because I think last year he was last year he was like the 16th or 17th highest paid wide receiver in football. Ultimately, when you look at that, you realize like when you have players like Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp being paid higher than Allen Robinson, the Bears got Allen Robinson on a bargain deal, and he proved that he deserves every penny of a new contract. And you also have to keep this in mind, is that he's also at a point where for him, he's only 27, 28 years old. So he's one of those rare instances where he's going to get a third contract and he's really in his prime. So with A-Rob right now, he's just trying to maximize what his true value is because it's not going to get higher than this.
Yeah. And but like people all the time say, oh, I feel so bad for Allen Robinson. I'm like, well, I don't, because 3 years ago he decided to, take more money with Chicago, and he had Green Bay and Aaron Rodgers on the phone offering him a contract 3 years ago in 2018, 2019 when he signed with Chicago, and he took more money and knew that they had a deficiency at quarterback. And now it's the business. You have to earn your next contract and keep playing. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. And I don't feel bad for the guy. And, obviously the franchise tag sucks, and I don't think it should be a part of the NFL, but that's a different conversation. So he got franchise tagged. It sucked. If they want to franchise tag him again next year, he's going to get a serious payday. But, you could also be looking at a potential tag and trade. What do you think of that?
I'm not sure a tag and trade is going to happen for the Bears and Allen Robinson this year, just because I believe that the Bears, if they were serious about a tag and trade for him, it probably already would have happened, just because you're not going to hold on. If there's a player that you're going to trade, you're not going to hold on to him too much longer. Now, granted, the draft is still about 2 weeks away, which means that something could really materialize. I would say that with where the Bears are at, they're in a situation where if they feel like, hey, they're going to get a guy like Orlando Brown Jr., for example, and extra draft picks that are going to help them trade up for a quarterback, then in that situation, you go ahead and you package Allen Robinson, say, hey, bye-bye, because we believe that having a guy like a Justin Fields or a Trey Lance is so much better. But other than that, I just don't see them straight up just saying, hey, tag and trade Allen Robinson for only draft picks. I think if you're the Bears, you need to get some young players in return to build around.
Yep. So the release of Kyle Fuller, a couple of restructures as well, it really seemed like the Bears were clearing space for a huge piece. Based on how the season finished and where they are now, would you consider this free agency period to be a failure?
I wouldn't consider it to be a total failure. I will say that Ryan Pace, the GM, he went ahead and he made a lot of conservative signings. Didn't make any erratic signings. Like in 2020, he made some erratic signings, paying Robert Quinn a big deal, paying Jimmy Graham a big deal on day 2 or 3 of free agency, when in reality, the Bears could have waited and had Graham for much cheaper than the $16 million deal that they signed him for. Now, you mentioned Kylo Fuller. I will say Kylo Fuller was a bit of an interesting release to me because he was due $20 million. He's not a top 5 cornerback in my eyes, but he's also been like a 2-time All-Pro. My bigger question was, if you're going to save $10 million, why not cut Akeem Hicks over Kyle Fuller? And so those are the types of confusing decisions that you look at and you're like, all right, you know what? Ultimately, you look at the situation, you realize that the Bears would have been better off like cutting Hicks and keeping Fuller, because you downgraded, one spot on your defense, which was probably one of your strongest and most consistent pieces.
Yeah, and talking about the D-line, Robertson Harris goes out the door to Jacksonville. Were you expecting at all to re-sign him, and how much of a hole does this open up at the nose tackle position?
I wasn't expecting Robertson Harris to be gone anyway, just because you look at him, he's a classic example of a player that emerges as an undrafted free agent, becomes a solid contributor, really maximizes his value, plays much better than a lot of people realize. And Robertson Harris is one of those guys that not a lot of people outside the Bears fan base even knew who he was. And so now you go to Jacksonville, where he's going to be a starter for the Jags, and he's going to be a very good piece on that defensive line. Ultimately, when you look at the Bears, right, they were never serious about bringing Robertson Harris back just because they knew they didn't have the money to. It's not necessarily a downgrade just because they do get back nose tackle Eddie Goldman, who opted out of the 2020 season due to COVID concerns. And then they have Bilal Nichols as well. Yeah, they lost Brent Urban on the defensive line, but you bring back Mario Edwards, who emerged last year, and then you also sign Angelo Blackson. So really, defensive line depth in terms of experience, the depth did take somewhat of a hit, but they are right where they need to be for the defensive line.
Yeah, and it's been one of the best in the league for a while. Bears defense kind of carried them towards the end of the year last year. They were playing well. Offense was scoring points, surprisingly. Those last couple of games, like I said, Mitch was really getting a stride and playing well. And then obviously the defense was still top 10 once again in what seemed like a down year, a couple injuries, a couple opt-outs, but their defense still top 10, like always, like it's been the last 4 years. But let's talk about pick 20. What positions other than quarterback can you see them attacking if they do stay at 20? Now, if they stay at 20, most likely not going to be a quarterback, because that would be either a reach or yeah, it would be a reach, because I don't see really any of the guys falling to 20. So let's say they stay at pick 20. What positions can you see them attacking? And for you, who are some prospects that you're running to the podium for?
I would say if you're at pick 20, you need to go offensive tackle. People talk about, well, the Bears need to figure out the offensive tackle, and they're not wrong. Look, Charles Leno Jr. has been good. He's not as bad as fans make him out to be. He's just been good, but they certainly can find an upgrade. I would say if a guy like a Christian Darrisaw or Rashawn Slater is there, you go after him. Kevin Jenkins from Oklahoma State. Those are my top 3 guys. If you're not going to go quarterback, there's no point in going any other position besides offensive tackle, because those are your 2 big needs. In terms of wide receiver, I would say, let's just say Devontae Smith falls that far. Then you go ahead and you draft Devontae Smith, add more playmakers for Andy Dalton, and hope that Juan Castillo, your offensive line coach, can kind of just stabilize the offensive line and address offensive line later on in day 2. But ultimately, for me, like if you're not going to go quarterback, then you go offensive tackle to protect the quarterback.
Yeah, and it's a great tackle class there. Looking at the first 3 rounds, there's sweet spots in the first round, towards the end of the first round. Top of the second round, middle of the second round is going to be very, very good for offensive tackles. And then when you get to the middle of the second round, it's like there are a couple of guards who could turn into starters. Then third round, when you get into the Christensens, the Eichenbergs, the Radinses, the Spencer Browns, guys who are more developmental but have some serious NFL skills in terms of athleticism, length, size, that type of stuff. It's a very diverse offensive tackle class. It's a good year to need one. It's a good year to need two or three. But Tevin Jenkins, I've mocked him to Chicago a multiple amount of times. I think he's the second behind Sewell, the second best run blocker in the draft. He's very tough. He's also very versatile. People don't know this. He's played every single offensive line position against center. What do you think that type of versatility can bring to the Bears offensive line?
Well, the Bears value versatility on the offensive line. I mean, you look at it. Cody White here coming out of Kansas State 6 years ago, he was playing left guard. They moved him over to center. Then you look at James Daniels. He was playing center at Iowa. The Bears experimented with playing him at left guard. Those Iowa offensive linemen are very versatile. And then look at Alex Bars, for example. He, for the Bears, played left guard, and right tackle at different points in 2019 and 2020. Ultimately, I think when you look at that, it really signals that the Bears want versatility in their offensive linemen. They don't want a guy that's just going to be drafted to play like right tackle and only be a right tackle. They want someone that they can move around. So that versatility that Tevin Jenkins brings is what I believe makes him an underrated part, or really an underrated pick that a lot of people are not mocking to the Bears right now, but they should be.
Yeah, and I take credit. I'm not. I don't take credit, but I feel very proud of myself. I had him mocked in the first round a while ago, like back in December, January. I had him in the first round. I love him. First round grade for me. Very good player. Probably will end up going in the first round just because of how physical he is. Once again, the versatility. But before I let you go, I do this with everyone. I'm gonna name you some prospects who I think could be there, and you're gonna tell me you're Ryan Pace, you're Matt Nagy, who you're taking. So let's start. So the receivers are gone. Waddle, Chase, Smith they're all gone. Bateman and Marshall are there. Tony's there too. Jenkins is there. Darrisaw's not. Jalen Mayfield is there. Any other positions you think they might attack, or
No,
just those guys?
I mean, I would say cornerback, but I think this cornerback class is also deep enough to the point where they can find a guy in round 2.
So let's go. Okay, so Greg Newsome and Asante Samuel are there at 20, and then in addition to the players that I just named. So who are you taking?
Honestly, I'm going to go with Tevin Jenkins. Like I said, just continue to stand my foot in the ground with him. I think you look at some of those other guys like Terrence Marshall Jr. I covered the LSU Pro Day. The big thing with him is he's versatile, right? So he can play inside, he can play outside.
Yep.
And then you have a guy like Kedarius Tony. Now, Tony to me is the most overrated prospect in this year's draft because I also covered the Florida Pro Day. And I'll tell you guys right now, for those of you listening to this, Tony is essentially going to be Cordero Patterson 2.0 at the next level. I understand people have him mocked as, oh my God, he's a first round guy. He's electric. He's got blazing speed. But here's my problem with Tony is that the guy really is still learning to be a wide receiver. So in any other draft class, he would have been probably like the 10th or 11th best wide receiver on the board and been a surefire day 3 pick as a guy who wins with his speed. Tony's just not a complete route runner. Yeah, he's a hard runner. You can place him all over the field, but for a player who's still learning how to really play the wide receiver position, he's not a guy that you're going to spend that any team I think would be spending a first round pick on. It's not just exclusive to the Bears. So Tony's going to be a second round pick. So some team's going to gamble on his potential, but I just would not take him in either round 1 or round 2.
Interesting hot take there. He is either my 4 or 5. I'm a lot higher on him. His film is fantastic, but I do get what you're saying. Not here to argue with you, of course. Agree to disagree there on Kadarius Tony. I think he's going to be more than a Marquise Brown, but also Marquise Brown did come in the NFL he was still learning to play receiver as well, and I'm not someone who's mocking Tony to the Ravens. I think that would make no sense. They need someone who's not a big body, but a pure route runner, someone who will help Lamar Jackson, not just down the field, but in those short, medium routes as well. I don't think Kadarius Tony is that guy. If they draft him, I would probably laugh because I think that's a bad pick. But anyways, Usayd, great to have you on, man.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on, man.
Anytime. So make sure to follow him on Twitter at Usayd Koshul. It'll be right there for the spelling and everything like that. But Usayd, awesome to have you on. Thank you everybody for listening to this episode of 32 Teams in 32 Days, and I'll catch you in the next one.